year's series, I feel strange reminding us that the name of the series last year was After the Hurricane. But in all, without being funny, I first envisioned this a number of years ago. For some reason, it came to me using the metaphor of rain and storm. Because as we see in our front lawns today, in our very lives, it is a powerful metaphor. Look how destructive it can be. It's become fashionable since the end of the Second World War to refer to it as the Holocaust. That's a fire metaphor. Right? And that's perfectly appropriate as well. But there's also a water metaphor. Fire causes great destruction, so does water. Look at what's happened to us just now. And for some reason, when we first started this particular series, which is now in its 4th year, I guess, I'll be doing it 6 years or 7 years now, but it's this particular series, I called the years 1914 to 34 stormy years. Because for Jews in Europe, they were. You had the First World War and all the cataclysm that involved, and the aftermath of the First World War, which was so tough for all the Jews of Europe. And then, after that, we did the next series on the years 33 to 45, which was the hurricane. Was it not? We are living now through the appropriateness of that metaphor. I mean, the Hitler and all that came on the Jews, like we read about, they just smashed the house and just swept whole population away of 6 million people. And then last year, we moved past that to after the hurricane. And when the Jewish people, then as a people, like the population now in the Mid-Atlantic states, had to pick up the pieces and try to create something new, rebuild their house, do something. And that's what Klal Yisrael had to do after 45. You cry, and then what? Where do you go? And that's one of the main reasons the State of Israel came to be, because it was just needed. And ironically, as I mentioned last week, and I've mentioned in the past also, the real people that got Israel established as a fact in international opinion was the DPs. Because you can have all the Haganah, the Palmach, and all this you want. If the United Nations, nations of the world would not agree, it wouldn't happen. That's just the name of the game. And the great players, like Truman and others, to the degree that they were moved whatsoever to support this, was not because they were struck by the cogency of the Zionist argument, because they weren't. Not because they were in love with the idea of a religious state, because you know they didn't like that idea as Americans, a one-faith state. But they did it because it was after the hurricane. And they saw with their own eyes, or at least in movies and films, the kind of unbelievable devastation that had been undergone by the survivors, and just something in the Kishka said you got to do something about it. And finally we moved to this year, in which Israel was established, and the first years of 48-52, there was a ship, but it had to go through choppy waters. And many times the ship threatened to capsize. And choppy waters means that you have high waves, it's something that to go through the waves, and you know, like you see in the pictures, the huge waves splash the ship, and some people get swept off of the deck. Isn't that true? And so the ship may survive, but there are casualties. And that, I'm arguing, is a pretty doggone accurate reflection of the first years of Israel, I'm sorry to say. But we're here tonight, I hope, to see, at least my opinion, of what actually happened. And in that spirit, I move to my remarks. So tonight we're talking about the second part of what we spoke about last week, the welfare state and mass immigration part 2, successes and failures of a totalitarian democracy. If you think the word totalitarian democracy is well, and if you wished it to be an oxymoron, actually it's the name of the most famous book published in Israel in 1952 by the leading Israeli political scientist who characterized Israel at that time as a totalitarian democracy, and it's a very accurate description, because it was a democracy in the sense that they did have elections, but once they had the elections and the Mapai put together a government, they ran the government whatever they wanted, whether the people liked it or not. And if you're one of the people that I'm going to be speaking about tonight, you experience Israel not as a democracy. You experience Israel as a totalitarian state. There are historical reasons for it that we're going to go into, But you understand that it's not a simple picture whatsoever. The state of Israel is not like this today. Among other reasons, there is no single dominant party, and life has changed, and the media and everything has changed, and so it's a new world. But I'm taking you back, or I'm trying to take you back, 65 years? Is that what it is? Something like that. Ancient history, isn't it? But it's not so ancient. We have people here that remember this very well. And it was, as I said before, totalitarian as well as a democracy. And it turns out that the terms do not have to be oxymoronic. It's kind of interesting in that regard. So let me begin my remarks by starting out and saying that the Jewish community in Israel, the Yishuv, on May 14th, 1948, was rather, I'm sorry, I want to, before I forget it, I beg your pardon. I do want to call your attention, I could kick myself. We're going to be, as you see over here, we have the Israel trip all put together. We have a number of people, but I still need about another dozen or so to make it work, to tell you the truth. It's going to be very interesting. Those who've been on my trips know what I'm talking about. But I want to talk it up for a minute before I get into this. We're going to be, because it's kind of unique this time. I have 2 days planned to do something called the Masah Moshavot. I don't know, probably nobody's even heard of it, and it hasn't gone on it. Maybe 1 or 2 people have. Rav Kook and Rav Chaim Sonnenfeld and the other big rabbis in Jerusalem back in 1913, just before the First World War started, used to fight a lot, but they buried the hatchet temporarily. And they buried the hatchet as to go on a joint journey northward. A whole bunch of rabbis and people like that from the old Yerushalayim, what they call the Yishuv HaYashan, to visit the new Zionist settlements. This is before the kibbutzim even started. The new Zionist settlements in the Galil. And the reason is because they said, like Rav Kook said at the time, Rav Chaim said also, there's no communication and no dialogue between the old Jewry and the new. To put it in modern terms, there's no dialogue between the religious and the not religious. Does that sound something from 100 years ago? Or does it sound something like from today? It's remarkable. And people like the most extreme right wing. Rav Chaim Sonnenfeld, you might say in a certain sense, is the father perhaps of the Neturei Karta, certainly of the Eid HaChareis. He was the head of the Eid HaChareis. And they all acknowledged that there's a disconnect over here, and what they hoped at that time was not to do what we have in America, which is you go your way, I go my way. There's 2 Jewries living side by side with no connection with each other whatsoever. Politically they say there are, and it's nicer, but in reality there's no real dialogue between one and the other. One Jewry puts 100,000 people in a stadium to celebrate what they call Siyam HaShas. The other one has never even heard the word Shas. It's just not part of the radar. And they didn't want this 100 years ago to be in Israel. And so they had this remarkable tour through cold. It was in December of 1913. You know what that's like. All the way up to all the new settlements that have been formed, trying to bring Yiddishkeit, as we would say today, and trying to get to Kashrus and this and Shabbos and what all the rest of it. And this tour, which is run by the Beit HaRav Kook, the wonderful tour guides and professors, they take from community to community, go to physically, and in each community they had a different reception. Sometimes it was a positive one. People said, you know, Rav Kook was a great orator, and others, and they said, we'll adopt a tradition or a certain amount of tradition. And in some of these other settlements, they say, you're wasting your time. Chaval Azman, Pola Tashbiya Klum. That's what they say. You're not going to do anything. And Rav Kook said, we didn't come to mashpia on you, we came to be mushva by you. And he tried to be diplomatic. But the first attempts on the very complicated Israeli reality kind of date back to that. So I'm very excited about that particular trip, which is going to take 2 days. It's a long business to go from community to community. It's like taking a tour of all of northern Israel. We're going to be doing the Yom Kippur War, and at last announcement when I spoke with my guy in Israel, I hope we'll be having General Kahalani, who will be going with us to the battlefield of where he was the Israeli commander, where 6 tanks held off the Syrian army. That really happened. I mean, I think some of you know what I'm talking about, and it's actually the most remarkable battle in Israel's history. It shouldn't have been 6 tanks. There was a lot of snafus, as you know, in the higher ranks. But at the end of the day, the mistakes of the Golda Meir government were redeemed by the blood and the sacrifice of a small, dedicated handful that held off the Syrian army, who, if they would have broken through, I need not say any more. So excited about that. And we're also going to be going later on to Nitzana, which I spoke about last year. That was a site in 48 war on which they made an end run around the Egyptian army, had a very desperate series of battles, Yigael Yadin and Yigael Alon, and which almost, this is, I'll tell you the good half, I'll tell you the bad half. The good half is they kicked the Egyptians out of the Negev, and Israel was taking over the Negev. The bad half is they could have taken the Gaza Strip, but it was right there, and Truman wouldn't let him. I think if Truman was around now, he said, I should have let him. You understand? No, look at the trouble the world is going through as a result of this. You understand? So I think it'd be very dramatic. There's a couple other things over there. I just throw that out at you to give you an idea of what it is that I'm planning. And this will appeal to some, it won't appeal to others. If it appeals to you and it works out and all the rest of it, you're talking about $2,100 or something. I think that's the price for the land package, if I have to get there on their own. But if you're at all interested in this, then please do see me in the next 2 weeks or so, or next 3 weeks.
One of the yeshuvim where they stopped, first one of the things they did was like very aggressive does today. They would go there and they would dance with them. They wouldn't talk philosophy, they would go there, they would dance with them. And one of the yeshuvim, they saw that there was this man who was sitting on the sidelines who wasn't that excited about it. And they tried to schlep him in, talk to him, he had no interest. So ultimately what they did was, they did like a Purim thing where they put, they wore his Kova temple or whatever the Israelis wore in those days, and they put their rabbinic garb on him, and he danced and enjoyed it, and ultimately they brought him in like that. My point is that they also sacrificed their dignity. Could you imagine, Ramosha Feinstein, Rav taking off his kavata and putting on someone else's, Kova temple?
If that's true, that'll be an interesting part of the story. I mean it. If somebody's, before I depart this subject, the year, shortly after they did the trip, as a guy wrote it up. It's a classic sefer. It's called Eid L'Maseh by Rabbi Yonasan ben Yamin Horowitz of Yerushalayim, for those that are interested in sources. And you can access the material, I guess, yourself. But this, we're going to go to where it happened. All right, enough of that. Now I'll get down, as I say, for my remarks. It's around the right time anyway. The Yishuv, right? The Yishuv. No, we'll skip that now. We'll go right into it. That's for December 2nd for anybody's interested in the American Civil War, but that's not what we're here for tonight. The Yishuv, the Jewish community of Israel, until May of 1914, was very homogeneous. That's the point I want to get across. It's thanks to the Gucci Aliyah that I keep referring to, but since they controlled who should get in and the right person should get in, the result of this was a eugenic situation. 80% was Ashkenazim, 20% Sephardim. The Jewish community in Israel had a certain strength because of its homogeneous character, even though there was only 650,000 people. That's one of the reasons they won in 1948 war, even though they were, at least demographically, outnumbered by the Arabs. But I told you, in terms of military soldiers, the Jews have more than the Arabs. That's because since they were all the same type and roughly the same kind of education, you could mobilize the boys, you could mobilize the girls. You can mobilize everybody in a way that the Arab countries were not able to do. As a result of the new mass aliyah that I spoke about last week and that we're looking at tonight, it's going to be changing the numbers because it's 55 Sephardi, 45% Ashkenaz. So all of a sudden you're talking about the influx into Israel of a huge number. I mean, the total number is still going to be Ashkenaz because of the old numbers of 80% population plus 45% new immigrants. But it's going to be a significant new influx of Sephardim, and as they say, Eastern Jews, into Israel, which is something that wasn't there before. That's what I want to get across. It was not the case before. The huge difference also between, let's say, the mass immigration that comes, I don't know, to the United States on the one hand. We've had millions and millions of people pouring over here in 17, 18, 1900s, and what happened in Israel, because what happened in America, first of all, was a self-selected aliyah, as it were. The people who came to this country weren't brought in by the United States, they came on their own. So it takes a certain type of person to cross the ocean and do that in the old days. And second of all, and perhaps more important, America offered nothing and gave you nothing except opportunity. It's interesting to recall that during the periods of mass immigration historically into the United States, it's before there was Social Security, it's before there was unemployment, it was insurance, it was before there was this kind of benefit, and Medicare and Medicaid and all the rest of it. Everybody knows. You came to America and you're on your own. You make it, you make it. You don't make it, you starve. The heck with you. And since people knew it, and they came with that in mind, So they made the best of it and didn't complain if times was hard. They just figured like this: I'll work in a sweatshop, but my son will be a doctor. The classic model. Or like the German Jews who came over early. I'll get a penny and I'll turn it into 2 pennies. And then the 2 pennies, I'll peddle it into 4 pennies. And eventually I'll own Macy's. And this did it. And it happened. That's how Macy's started. That's how Gimbel started. That's how Hustler, Hochschild Kohn, and all the quote-unquote German Jewish businesses, they all started with nothing. And they built it up little by little. And so since the culture was such that the government offered you nothing, so when people had individual hard times, they didn't complain about it because they knew this is what was the deal. Israel, the state of Israel, was founded in 1948 as a Jewish state, but it's also true that the overwhelming consensus, I think the universal consensus of all the political parties was, it's all going to be a welfare state. Because all of them had imbibed the doctrines of the 20th century, the late 19th and 20th century, which was that a modern state, in order to be civilized, has to be socialist to one degree or another. It is the responsibility, the social responsibility, this is what they all believed in. The Mapai and the Mapam for sure, but the religious party, the general Zionists, this group, that group, they all subscribe, the revisionists all subscribe to the notion that the state has to provide and make sure that there's health, education, welfare, housing, food, and all this kind of stuff for the population. If you can get it on your own, fine. If not, we have to provide it for you. It wasn't like America, for example, or all these other countries, which is, you make it, you make it. You don't make it, tough luck. And you come in knowing that. And so that means when they bring in these huge numbers and double the population in a very short time, think about that. They promised all these people health, education, welfare, food, housing, and daycare, and all the rest. At least that's the official policy. And that's very expensive, is it not? It's very expensive. Now, it's expensive. Israel has no money. I'll tell you right now, in 48, 49, from taxes, Israel got 60 million. And we know that, right? So it's public figures. You get what I'm saying. How much revenue does the taxes bring in? 60 million. 60 million is nothing, correct? Especially when you have to run a country, a government, an army, a military situation, and all the other basic expenses for the population of 650,000. And the Arabs, the 150,000 Arabs that are here as well. So where are you going to get the money for all these new people coming in? The money's not there. Israel in those years cannot afford, on 60 million, you can't afford the necessary imports. That's what it is. To make all this happen, housing and all the other things all the other nice things we'd like to have, hospitals, roads, schools, and I guess daycares. I mean, we'd like to have it all. Playgrounds. It costs money. And in Israel, in 1948, had no industry hardly. And what do you get? You got to buy abroad. You got to buy abroad with money, and they don't have any money. It's the eternal problem. Israel, in these years, 48 to 52, unwisely, did not develop exports. It's not what they chose to do. At least manufacturing exports. The Mapai Party, because of culture, and culture plays such a large role in our story tonight and in the other lectures I plan to give in this series. The culture was farming and agriculture. They were committed to putting major resources into Israeli agriculture. And this was a mistake. Because first of all, it's not economical. You tell me, look, I have a kibbutz and it produces all the rest of it. If I had to put 10 million bucks into the kibbutz till it worked, a businessman is not interested in this more because you're not going to get that kind of return. It doesn't justify it. Second of all, the modern industrial economy is just that. It lives or dies on its ability to manufacture industrial items of one kind or another and sell them in the international market. That's basic. And they didn't see that because they're still in the 19th century romanticism, which is we're going to create the new Jew and the model society, which is going to be a bunch of farmers, self-reliant farmers, Jews close to the earth, rooted, as they say, in the land, and all the other kind of 19th century romanticist rhetoric that was so popular in all the countries of the West, and which captured the imagination of the early Zionists, especially the early socialist Zionists. And it's a great idea. We're not going to have the ugly, bent-over, hawk-nosed Jew selling something in a little shop on in Delancey Street or in the Levski Street in Warsaw, the rest of it. We have the tall, handsome man and woman, sunburned, muscular, simple, devoted to the earth. But this is all baloney, because the country needs scientists, and the country needs educated people, the country needs engineers, true or not. The country needs teachers, they need specialists in every branch of economic endeavor if they're going to be able to produce goods that they'll be able to sell successfully in the international market. The other countries of the world were moving past the agriculture in 1948. America, Europe in general, are putting their main money where? In industry. Not putting in agriculture. Agriculture very important, but and they put money in there also. But the main focus has to be in the industry. If I say to you, I'll just use a code word that you know exactly what I'm talking about, a buzzword as they say today, Israel, startup nation, startup economy. We all know what that means. Well, what is that about agriculture? It's about high-tech industry of today. So, I say this unfortunately because from day one, Israel should have hit the ground running on focus on what I'm talking about, on developing the industry and the exports and all that kind of stuff to generate money in order to pay for all these people that are coming in, among other things. That's not what they chose to do. And so they got very little money coming in from the revenues, and they didn't get any money hardly from, basically nothing from the exports. The Mapai government, I'll speak about this later on, which was the ruling class for 30 years, especially in these years, the Ben-Gurion years especially, was not the government that was able to attract foreign capitalist investment. A ton of Jewish businessmen, in 48 already, and in 49, and in 50, these are good guys, from Baltimore, Maryland, from Boston, from Chicago, from London, from Johannesburg, from Antwerp, from Switzerland. A ton of these guys visited Israel, and they came with the best of intentions. And they came with the best of intentions, they want to start something up. And that's ideal. And invest money in a way that they can make a profit. Nothing wrong with that. But that means they're going to put investments in, they'll build a business, they'll hire people, won't they? You know, all that sort of thing. And the Mapai government at that time said like this: you come in, you give us the money, we'll tell you how to spend it, we'll tell you how much labor costs to pay, you'll do everything through the Histadrut, and so on and so forth. And one after another, it's a very tragic story. And I'm not going to, I could give a whole lecture on that, but I'm not going to. One after another, each one of these guys, very nicely and very kindly, they said, I'll think it over, thank you very much, but you know, they got on the plane, they got the heck out of there. And even the guys that put some money down, they said, I'm walking away from this. I put 10 grand down, I'm never going to see it again, shalom. You know, keep the money. And there were actually some Israeli leaders who said, oh, we ripped them off, we got the $10,000, the idiot. You understand? That's not the way to operate. But these were national leaders who had no experience in economics. I'm just sorry to say, that's what it is. This guy, Eliezer Kaplan, was the finance minister. He kept telling everybody, come on over and invest, all the rest of it. But then they ran into this guy, the next fellow, Pinchas Lavon, who was the head of Histadrut. And he said, I guess, bring the money and we'll tell you what to do with it. In fact, why don't you give me the money up front and we'll tell you exactly what to do with it. You understand? Finally, this is something, again, many will understand today, a huge failure of Israel during the years of 48-52 was their failure to develop, again, I'll use a buzzword, to develop an AIPAC. It didn't happen. The early Ben-Gurion government had an ambassador in Washington, this guy Elio Eilat, as you see over here. He's giving Truman Torah number 5500, the umpteenth time. I mean, how many Torahs he got in that year? But okay. But Elio Eilat was the first ambassador, and he told the American Jews, we're in control of everything. We'll deal with the American government. You be available when we need you, but meanwhile, go home. We don't want other people treading on the sovereign territory, notice political territory, of what's purely the Israel. Notice the embassy, you know, wanted total control. And again, it was just a lack of sophistication. They didn't get it. To be perfectly honest, the impact didn't really start till around 52, 53, and it took them a decade or two, about 10, 15 years to get off the ground. By the time you came to the late 60s, everything was in place. And ever since then, history has been different. So, Abba Hillel Silver, Emmanuel Newman, people like this, they could have, excuse me, if Israel needed a couple $100 million, I mean, I'm saying this from what I know. When I say what I know, it's my opinion, obviously, but it's based on a lot of research. If you know who the Congress was in 1949, if you know who the political movers and shakers were in 1949, if you knew who the influential Jews were in the United States and their relations with the individual senators and all that sort of thing, if Israel would have gone the route that I'm talking about, they could have raised a couple $100 million off the Truman administration every year. because this was the peak years of the foreign aid. The Marshall Plan had a universal consensus almost in the political classes, and there was also a consensus among the movers and shakers in Congress. I mean people like Senator Taft in the Republican Party. I mean people like Senator Lucas and Lyndon Johnson, who were the new senators that came aboard in 1948. Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson, people like that, Paul Douglas. These were Stuart Symington, who was a very big, but people don't even know that, from Missouri, a very, very important supporter of Israel. The head of the majority leader, Democratic majority leader in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, was John McCormick, who later on, some of you remember, became the Speaker of the House. He had a Jewish district. He had like Park Heights. That was his district over there. The Republican leader of the House of Representatives, Joe Martin, next door to a Jewish district, also from Massachusetts. These are two guys that went to Israel 20 times in the years 48, 52. I mean, it went like a bunch of times. If you would have had an effective AIPAC at that time, if the Israel embassy would get out of the way and they say, you guys do it, but here's what we need, $250 million because we have that much. Because we have a ton of immigrants coming in and the costs are enormous, but they didn't do it. So I'm just telling you, when you consider these years, there's a lot of things that coulda, woulda, shoulda. And finally, Israel failed to get world Jewry excited once the war was over. During the war, a Golda Meir could come to America and in a month raise $50 million. That's one of her great achievements. Because it was during the War of 48, and she says, we're fighting in Jerusalem, we're fighting in the Galilee, we're fighting in the Negev, it's backs to the wall, do something. And then, in fact, she did it twice, if you want to know. Right? She did it just before May 14th, and she did it afterwards. That's an amazing accomplishment. But, you know, the public's attention span is not that long. And once the war was over, although you and I know the needs were great, but something was lost in the air. A lot of the air went out of the balloon, as they say. And it wasn't possible, or it didn't happen. So there's no money. And the new Olim are not pioneers. The vast majority of people we're talking about bringing over, I've described to you. They got them out of Czechoslovakia and places like that. They're survivors from the Holocaust in one way or another. They're coming from places like Yemen or Iraq, where they are not coming from pioneers. They're basically being told that they're escaping an Arab pogrom, which may have been true, may not have been true. In the long run, it's certainly true. Many of them are old. Many of them are, they're not the pioneer types. Prior to 48, certainly prior to the Second World War, what kind of people used to come under the Zionist control and get certificates to enter Palestine? Pioneers. By that I mean people who went through Hachshara, they were indoctrinated, they took agricultural training, they took Hebrew lessons back in Europe, and so they came, so to speak, ready to jump in with both feet the minute they landed and fully participate in building up what they call the yeshuva, the national institutions. These new people come in. You have an old grandmother from Yemen or Morocco or something like that. I mean, you know, she's not going to do it. She come to live out the rest of her life in Israel. In fact, you bring anybody, even if they're not old, and they have no education, and they're 30 or 40 years old and they have a family, they're not going to become major economic pioneers in Israel. These people do not want to go to kibbutz. That's not what they wish to do. They certainly don't want to be put in a frontier area opposite the Arab border and say, plow this land, and if those guys shoot it, you duck, you know, or something like that. Or even you tell somebody that has no experience, now here's a gun, if they come in the night, shoot them. Right? I don't think most people in this audience would be prepared for that. So, consider that. Since most of the new Olim do not fit the preferred stereotype, they didn't look like those who had come to Israel prior to 1948, you get a very negative reaction on the part of what they call the Vatikim, you know, the regular Israelis who had been there until now. Even though the Israelis themselves haven't been there that long, but if I'm there 5 years longer than you, I've been on the Mayflower, you know. And you find that bitter but true statement on the part of the head of the Jewish Agency Absorption Department, Gary Yoseftal, who said what? He said, Yisrael rotzeh b'aliyah, but Israeli men are bolim. Israel wants aliyah, but they don't want the people. And it sounds funny, but you know what it means. In other words, we're all committed to the ideal that there should be immigration into Israel. But the Olim are so bad, you know, they're not the type we want. Why don't we get all supermen and superwomen? Now, 1948, the year 1948, May to December, was not so bad. The first 100,000 who came were mainly Ashkenazim. And there were empty Arab houses. There was what to do. And so they got off the boat and they stuck them in the Jaffa, into parts of Yerushalayim, like Katamon, place like that. Jaffa, Akko, Haifa, half the city had been abandoned by the Arabs, and places like that. There were a lot of villages all over the place. There were literally physical homes, better or worse, that you could put somebody into. So that's something. So you get them off the boat, you do the triage, with the documents, and then you put them somewhere. But by the beginning of 1949, there were no more houses. Now what? What do you do with the masses who, in the beginning of 1949, were literally pouring in every week? So when I say thousands of people pouring in all the time, that's not an exaggeration. It's a couple 100,000 people came in 1949. So think about what that means in terms of 50 weeks. Where do you put them? Leave them out in the open? Well, the only thing they had was abandoned British army tanks, army camps. Right? Okay, so the British had been there before they pulled out in 46. They had 100,000 British soldiers there. So they have a number of camps with physical facilities, rooms, maybe better. But the British, and I don't blame them, they were so bitter at the Jews, they trashed a lot of this stuff. They ruined it. You understand? They broke the beds, the lights, the toilets, the sinks. You understand the mentality, but nevertheless, it's there. Worse, Tzahal needs them. They want them. You go in with the chief of staff. He said, I'm trying to create a new army. The army is of vital importance for the security of the state. We're going to have an army of 100,000 people. We need the military camps that the British use. What are we supposed to do? And Ben Gurion said, like this. I don't think he meant it, but I'll tell you what he said. He said, I got to give the Tzahal priority because they can overthrow the government. Right? Now, I don't really think that that's true, but nevertheless, if it's a question, and I wouldn't want to be in Ben Gurion's shoes and decide guns or butter. But you have to decide, do you not? I'm sitting here and I have the luxury of saying I don't want to decide. But they had to decide. And so, what they do is, most of the camps are used for the army. Some of the camps will be used for klita, as they say, for absorption. The name of these types of camps was Machne Olim. The largest and most famous will be the British Army camp at St. Luke's, right next to Haifa, which is going to be named Shar HaAliyah. Okay, you already see how crowded it is, and really they're going to put up tents and things like that, and here you are in January, February, March of 49, 1,000 more, 1,000 more, 1,000 more, 1,000 more, 1,000 more, and I mean that because I see several 100,000 people came in a year, and so more and more and more. The ideal, what they planned, the ideal would be 5 days in the camp for the triage. You get your medical checkup. You get your basic citizenship documents, that sort of thing. And so, if it would work that way, so you'd have to feed and house somebody for a couple days. But the reality is, it didn't work that way because there's nowhere to send them. There's no shikun, as they call it. The shikun means housing. Okay? Look at it ends up this. She's there for weeks and weeks and months, and every day you're queuing up to get your food or things like that. The result is that there's not enough room in the barracks for all the people that are coming in, tens of thousands, and so they put up huts and tents in all type of weather. You end up with this famous picture standing in the rain of the girl from Robert Capa, the well-known photographer. It was the international winning prize. This shouldn't be Israel. This should be like some third world country. But that's what it was. Because here you are, it's March of 49, it's April of 49, more and more coming literally every day. Nobody is saying turn it off the spigot. And there is no room to put them. And what do you do? What do you do? The problem is there was no plan. Everything is done day to day, ad hoc, and it's a sad story. Eating, cafeteria style. Employment, there is no employment. It takes them 2 years to realize that the system they're doing is not only dysfunctional but counterfunctional simply because you're bringing somebody but keeping them in the camp all the time. A, you're feeding them 24/7. B, they are not doing anything for the economy. Right? I mean, it's bad enough if you have, like, say, an old lady, a grandmother from Yemen, Morocco, so she's not going to work. But she has kids. No, the kids are here. The son may be 25 years old or something, but he's all the time in the Machane Oleh, or there were several of these, the different Machane Oleh. What are they doing? The boredom is unbelievable. We're not talking about that there's a TV, right? We're not talking about that there's a library. I mean, it's terrible. What do you do all day long? Their worst part of this comes over and over again in the memoirs: zero privacy. Zero privacy. Here, look how people had to live. It's not their fault, but there is, no curtains, nothing. Israel gets scared. They say, what happens if these people burst down and run away? Put a barbed wire. They start cutting through the barbed wire, they build a wall. So it becomes a nightmare. It's not what was originally planned. The one who writes about this at great lengths, if you're interested, I can only give you a few details, obviously, in the relatively short time I have tonight, is if you get this book, which was a shocker when it came out, Tom Segev's 1949. If anybody's at all interested in what I'm speaking about tonight, this is what you should read. And I'll just read you a short business over here, and I will spare you the worst of it, because I don't think you can handle the worst of it, a nice audience like this. But and it's sad. And what he talks about over here is the fact that a journalist, this is a good thing, a journalist, I think from Haaretz or Davar, one of the newspapers, disguised himself as a new Oleh, and then lived through it for a week or something like that, and then wrote it up as an expose, and that's a good thing, right? That's called democratic journalism. That's a good thing, and it was what it was. And like I said, I'll read it to you very briefly over here. One day, a young man turned up in one of the camps and introduced himself as an immigrant from Germany. His name is Chaim. He called himself Chaim Klopstock, a bachelor of 28. He got his the official copied down the blue documents and gave him the white one with 3 coupons for dinner and supper that day and breakfast next day. Tomorrow, he was told in Yiddish, you come back and stand in line for the coupons, because without the coupons you won't get any food. Then he sent him to the quartermaster store, where the white card was taken away, and the immigrant was made to sign his name in a book, acknowledging receipt of the following equipment: 2 gray woolen blankets, a sheet, and a bar of soap. The blankets had yellowish stains on them and had obviously been used and never washed. The soap was hard and ill-smelling, and then the storekeeper sent him to look for a vacant bed. He was reality a correspondent, as I say, for Haaretz. Okay? The quartermaster did not know where to direct him, as the camp was full to overflowing. Gelblum, that's this guy's name, took his suitcase in one hand and thinks he had another hand and set forth. He saw before him a row of hall-like structures, roofed with tin. They had served the British Army for storage. These weren't even the places that he used for habitation. This was the Machsan, where the British had the ammunition and the things like that. There were also tents on the side. He opened door after door, and everywhere he saw the same sight. Scores and scores of bed, one next to another, all along the walls, and in the middle bundles, crates, and suitcases piled up. Clothing and eating utensils were everywhere. Many people were lolling on the beds, their clothes undone, eating, playing cards, or lying idly. He estimated there must have been at least 100 in each hall, both men and women. A rotten smell hung in the air. Here and there were diapers hanging on strings, and scores of children ran playfully among the beds. In each hall he was told there was no more room. Then he found out that they were lying to him because they didn't want to crowd anymore. A pregnant lady told him to force his way in. I passed her by the tent, he says, and I saw her trying to light some faggots which she had gathered on the surrounding dunes in order to cook something for a baby who was lying on rags on the ground, yelling with all its might. The tiny tent, originally meant for 2 people, 3 people, was packed full of beds, leaving no room to move. We came here on Friday 2 days ago, the lady said. There were 400 of us, and the camp was full. There was no room for any of us. We stood out in the open in the pouring rain until after nightfall. They set up these tents. The tent leaks, and the rain gets into the beds. The younger immigrants had forced their way into the meeting halls, and he also managed to grab a hold of a vacant bed near the hall. In one of them, people came going in and out. Not one of them remembered to close the door. Being the one nearest, I became the one who closed the door all day long. Many of the immigrants took their meals in their halls. In other words, right there, what you see in the picture. And some were cooking for themselves, actually. He went to the dining hall. The tables were strewn with sticky food remnants. The walls were bare, except for notices from the political parties, and pasted on the serving hutch. The notices called the immigrants to register with the party's representatives, who would be visiting the next day. After all, what's important is important. He waited 35 minutes for dinner. Before his turn came, he turned to his coupon. He got a tin bowl with vegetable soup, a tin plate with a ball of gefilte fish, and some cereal and 2 slices of bread. There were no knives or forks or spoons to be had. He was told that they were stolen. Later on, he was told that the real reason was that the mashgichim, the guys in charge of the kashrus, because this is Israel, so the Mizrahi has to have a kashrus inspector everywhere. feared that they would mix up the dishes, so they took all the stuff away. Right? Can you imagine that? I'm telling you, you couldn't believe this if you didn't. And meanwhile, people were telling them, over the night finally came after they talked. By now, everybody's taking off their shoes and socks, and the hall stinks and will stay stinking throughout the night. I don't know why, but they're afraid to open a window and let in a little air. Maybe it's a European thing, I don't know. Perhaps out of exaggerated fear for the children, perhaps to avoid endless arguments, because there's always someone who objects to an open window. The small children are placed on the chamber pots in the middle of everybody, and then the bed. The older children are partly undressed and already into bed. Here and there, old men are trying to sleep. They groan and clear their throats, unable to fall asleep, and then moan some more, whether from ill health or old age. And the majority, it goes worse. You get the idea. I don't have to continue this. If you're interested, you can read it yourself. And it's very enlightening in a sad way, but this is our past. And what I'm trying to show you is these people paying the price for the failures of planning and policy, even though I totally understand, and I think you do also, the motivations that move people to push for mass aliyah, and I respect that also, but instead of focusing on who to blame, let's acknowledge the suffering of the people who went through this process. And so it is what it is. These were gross violations of bourgeois standards. Now notice, the Israeli attitude, you can say like this: listen, he didn't kill you, gave you food. You can look at it that way. People said to them, if you were running away from Auschwitz, you'd be glad to get such conditions. But the answer was, well, we're not running away from Auschwitz. You see? I never promised you a rose garden, they were told. Yes, you did, they said. The head, Yitzhak Raphael, who was the head of the Torah last week from the Mizrahi party, ran the Aliyah, mass Aliyah. He and the others all said, oh, you come to Israel, it's a land flowing with milk and honey. You'll get a house, you get a job, you get a car, I don't know, all that kind of stuff. It's going to be great. It's going to be wonderful. All the rest of it. I promised you a rose garden. You see? And it wasn't. Who's in charge in this time? The three big Israeli officials is, of course, Levi Eshkol, who later became the prime minister, Giora Yoseftal, he's a Yeki who joined the Mapai party. He had a social service background in Germany. And Golda Meir, who we'll talk about, becomes the minister in charge of housing and all that kind of business. He's the minister and the government in charge of the whole catastrophe. These are three big machers in the Mapai party. The Mapai is determined that they will control the Klita process because they figure that way they'll get to control the votes. You understand? And there's a lot of power going on over here. After all, you're doubling the population. Think about what that means in terms of the next election. Eshkol was what the Mapai used to call a bitsuist, from the word bitsua. Gets things done. He had no education, but he worked the school of hard knocks, as they say, and he worked himself up from being on a little kibbutz to bigger, and he was used to just getting people together and making it happen. Maybe, but a lot of mistakes are made between A and Z, and a lot of mistakes were made between A and Z. He had no education or training in this sort of thing, and the leaders of Mapai had this attitude at that time, and it took Israel a decade to get rid of this attitude, which you don't need all that schooling, you don't need that fancy schmancy titles, all the credentials of baloney. The real stuff you do well, you work with your hands, you stay on the spot. That's nice for a speech. But at the end of the day, you kind of do need specialists. You do need people with special training. Right? And you're not the carbon, they are. And that's unfortunately what happened. During these years, he has a tough existence. He has to live from day to day, but the people in the camps also live from day to day, and they live under worse conditions. He's well aware of it. What is his goal if he sits down in a meeting? You have to take care of the basic needs, food, frankly, you have to provide bathrooms, things like that. And there's not enough food, and there's not enough bathrooms. And also, this is Eshkol in 48 to 52. And to move as many of these immigrants as possible into agriculture. Get them out of their unproductive situation, the bad habits that they've picked up over thousands of years living in Golas Nebuch, in ghettos in Europe and in the Arab world, and become the new Jews, and as I say before, start working the ground. This is the wrong crowd for that. I told you. It's a nice idea, but that's not what they came for, and that's not who they are. You can't take someone who worked, who had a grocery store, let's say, in Sofia in Bulgaria, or in Istanbul, or certainly in Prague and Budapest and Warsaw, somebody with what we call a bourgeois background, and that's their training and their education and the culture they're used to, and say, now go take a hoe and a rake and go work on the farm. That's the wrong crowd for that. What are you going to do? It's also one of his main goals to get as many people, as many of them as possible, to vote for Mapai. There will be elections in 1951. They figured it would last 4 years, but then because of politics, it broke down at 3 years. So you have thousands of people coming in all the time, and obviously they're not going to love the Rose Garden, but we got to get them to vote the right way anyway. Giora Yoseftal, he was the Johnny on the spot. He warned, it's remarkable, in 1945, he thought ahead, and he said, we have a disaster coming, because we're going to get a state, and then I know what's going to happen, they're going to want everybody to come in, and we're not going to have to be ready for it, and it's going to be a human being disaster. But you know, in 1945, 46, nobody was thinking in that way, right? They had bigger items on the agenda, and they did, I grant that. And they had Israel to get off the ground in terms of the United Nations, and Truman and all the rest of it. They had a war to fight. I totally understand it, but he wasn't wrong either. He was a Yeki, he was a bureaucrat, and he had all the pluses and minuses of the bureaucratic mentality. I mean that. He was organized, he was orderly, he was honest. He was in the Mapai, of course, so he wanted that, but he was, you know, he wanted to do well, but he was exquisitely aware that he has no resources, and that there's nothing to these people. And you know, every day you go to Haifa Harbor, and you see people getting off the boat with smiles on their face, and for the cameras, and they get down and kiss the ground, and he knows, and all those people around knows, what's coming for them in 5 minutes. You know, it's sad. Where are you going to get food? If they can't afford the money, where are you going to get food in 1948 to 52? Israel doesn't grow enough food. They put a lot of money into agriculture, and they did make improvements, no question about it, and they were in the process of taking over Arab farms in the years 48 to 52, but they don't have the big kind of production that's necessary for doubling the population. Which country has enough food for double the population in 4 years, 3 years? Nobody has that. The answer to that, they were lucky. It's called America. It's called Point 4. You probably never heard of it. Point 4 is before the Peace Corps. Truman, and as you'll see in a second, President Truman was elected, not re-elected, in 1948, as you know. Here we have a few days, we're standing just before the election, contest between President Obama and Governor Romney. But Truman was, as you know, supposed to lose, and unexpectedly he won. This was his first election, the only election, because he was the vice president who came in when Roosevelt died in April of 45. So he served out Roosevelt's term, then he was elected for his own term. In his inauguration in January 20, 1949, he gave a very famous speech attacking communism and all the rest of it, but he was in favor of foreign aid, and very idealistically, he said there's point 1, point 2, point 3, and what everybody latched on was point 4, because point 4 is we're going to give stuff away. You understand? And you'll hear in a second, I'll put it on there, it became famous. He says that we favor helping democracies, because this is the Cold War. They don't want to go into communism. We help democracies, provide them with the means to get themselves off the ground and become self-sufficient. And you know what Israel heard when he says. So let's listen to Truman for a second. 4.
Embark on a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas. I believe that we should make available to peace-loving people the benefits of our store of technical knowledge in order to help them realize their aspirations for a better life. Our aim should be to help the free peoples of the world through their own efforts to produce more food, more clothing, more materials for housing, and more mechanical power to lighten their burdens. Democracy alone can supply the vitalizing force to stir the peoples of the world into triumphant action, not only against their human oppressors, but also against their ancient enemies, hunger, misery, and despair.
Hunger, misery, and despair. Well, hunger, number one, okay? And so what it meant was that Truman was saying as American policy, they're going to help, as he calls, struggling free peoples, isn't that right? Struggling democracies, which Israel's democracy, get on their own feet and fight against hunger, misery, and war. Israel heard hunger, ding, right? So they go right away to Washington, and to be perfectly honest, the guy who made it happen, the food was Taft, who was a Republican, a conservative Republican, was a great friend of Israel, and also, as you know, come from Ohio, Midwest. And therefore, and this is good what I'm going to say, you have big food giveaway programs, it's the government paying the American farmers. Right? Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. The foreign aid that will go to Israel mainly, I think that's probably true today. We have AIPAC people here that can probably confirm it. Most of the money that goes to Israel is actually spent in the United States. Right? So it's actually going into the American economy. That's one of the reasons that important congressmen and senators back it. Because if you're a farmer, you understand one of America's big problems after the Second World War was too much food. The world was starving and we had too much food. Do you remember this? They used to put them away on battleships and silos all over the place until 1972. And so, and this year, Moshe Sharett, people there will go to Washington, and this told, Taft decided, he says, I'll make this happen. There are other senators in the South, and there are guys like Hubert Humphrey and Paul Douglas from Illinois, and something that benefits the American farmer is always going to get front play, and nothing wrong with it. And so Israel will survive day to day by getting food from America. I'm talking about grain and wheat and things like this for 4 years, without which they couldn't make it because they doubled the population, didn't have the food for it. If only, as I said before, they would have thought like that in terms of housing and other things like that, but they didn't. In January 1949, beginning of the 49 year, 28,000 people in the camps that I just saw. In December, 90,000 people in these camps. So the numbers tripled, and there was no place to put them. There's literally no more room in the various camps. What are you going to do? Here again, look at the next picture. No, skip that. No. Here. Here you have in Sha'ar Aliyah. They literally have to sit outside on the trunks. And then this picture was taken when there actually was no more room. You know, you're talking about the end in 1950. People have to sit outside. And so, obviously, that's not going to go anywhere. At that point, it's Eshkol's problem. Let's go back a little bit. No, next one. The Eshkol and Eliyav. Just go to the next, after that. Okay. Yeah, that's right, these two guys. Levi Eshkol was the head in charge of the whole business. And, even he saw, a year go by, this is not working. But what do you do? He got together with his number 2 guy, Ari Eliyav, maybe some of us remember him, who was his main assistant. And they said, we have to come up with a new model. And they do, and this is called the Ma'abara. Okay? That's the improvement. As beta out, that's the improvement over what I just described. And Ma'abara means transit, as I'll explain in a second. This is a step up from the Machaneh Olim. Everybody gets a house. Every family. The problem is, it's a tiny leaky shack of cheap wood or tin. It's not the final housing, that's called shikun. It's a temporary, transitory, it's called Ma'abara. At least you get a bit of privacy. Okay? Now, I'm not knocking that. Even if you live in junk, but simply to have 4 walls around you and your family, not that you have any privacy in your family, because one room. But it's still 1,000 times, after you've been through the other thing, this is a big step up, agreed? At least you have your own basic family privacy, but the living conditions are abominable. The houses that we're talking about do not really have a kitchenette, any place really to do any food. Most importantly, they don't have bathrooms. You understand? They don't have showers. It's not in there. There's garbage everywhere because not enough garbage trucks. And so you come in there and things are piled up all over the place. I mean, huge mounds. 53, I remember reading this number, 53 people, 1 toilet. You understand? 112 people, 1 shower. It is what it is. And by the way, and that's a step up from Machaneh Olim. The Ma'abarot are located usually next to cities or towns, not all of them. And one of the goals is to encourage residents to go into towns and nearby kibbutzim and look for work. That's where Eshkol was saying. He's saying, he used this language. even though I don't think he meant it as harshly as it sounds, but maybe he did. He says, the state is having enough trouble feeding these guys who are not doing any work to contribute to the economy. Let's get them off their rear ends and make them contribute something to the country. It's like their fault? But this is the language they used to say, let's move to something different. And so you have a place, you have this. He hopes over the course of time the Ma'abara will become a neighborhood of the nearby city. Sometimes it happened, sometimes it didn't happen, but I can tell you right now, the regular cities, and this is one of the worst parts of this period in Israel, the regular cities didn't have anything to do with any of them whatsoever. They look like the plague of death, and they want to have a regular middle-class existence. And like I said, Israel wants Aliyah, but not the Olim. Keep the riffraff away from here. Don't let them come neighbor and steal, and so on and so forth. And it's two Israels, two countries, living side by side, as you know. Any mayor, like the mayor of Tel Aviv, for example, who has any political clout, is able to use the political clout to say, like we say, Section 8 housing, not in my neighborhood, not near my city, over there, not here. And so, where do they end up? Come the victims of the power situation in terms of the city. Now, on the other hand, I saw Aryeh Gross is here. I want to put the other side also. Where is he? There you go. He can tell. I'm almost tempted to. You want to come up and talk about it for a second? Okay. No. I'm going to tell you what. I'll tell you what I'm saying. It's not. I don't mean for funny. Sometimes there were some families. He told me last week. It started raining. We'll see in a movie in a second. It's impossible to be over there. And some people took in kids from the Ma'abara, and his family, when he was a kid, raised a Yemenite kid in the house for a year or more. Because of the national emergency and as a chesed. But how many were like that? Nowhere near, obviously, a tiny group. Nowhere near what's necessary for the situation. So an ideal world, ideal world, here we are talking about the hurricane problem. An ideal world, everybody should take in a kid or two. Theoretically. If everybody would take in a kid or two, that would solve the problem, or substantially. But it doesn't happen. It's not what people wish to do. You understand? It's not the way it went. And so, where does it go? There was a group of goody-goodies, I mean this in a good way, called Sherut Mitnadvim, that started in that year, just regular Israelis, not religious, some religious, and they said, just what I told you, let us go into the camps and let us interact with the people just like we say in the best American tradition, right? Get volunteers who want to go and help. The Mapai decisively rejects it. This is the province of the government. This is the province of the officials. Stay the heck out of there. You guys are obviously planning to start your own political party and compete against us. It became a sad casualty of the politics. But there's not much work to be had. So let them go out and get out. It's a retarded economy. It's not developed the way it ought to be, and the money they're putting is into agriculture. And so Eshkol goes for public works projects, which is what everybody does, especially forestry, build forests, what they call yi'ur. And we'll see about that in a minute, because I have a movie to show you. When it rains, in 1949, 50, 51, 52, it's a swamp, because there's no paved roads in the Ma'abara. This only adds to the unintended result, but the result, which is the demoralization, perhaps the dehumanization of the Ma'abara dwellers. Right? A subject much written about in the Israeli press at the time. The lack of housing and work destroys the family unit. It is what it is. It subjects the family unit to unbearable strains. Kids, especially coming from the Oriental countries or whatever, the Middle Eastern countries, you expect what you and I take for granted, we go crazy. I went crazy, I lost my power for a day. But Baruch Hashem had everything else. Think about people at this moment, and it's going to be temporary, we know, thank God, who lost their house in the Five Towns or something like that. What if and it shouldn't happen this way, what if it went for months and years and years? What would happen to the family unit, the father who can't deliver for the family? The mothers are garnished. Not through forces of their own, but through overwhelming situation. What do the kids feel like this? What does it do to parental authority, the notions of right and wrong, to telling kids you don't steal, and all the other delinquencies that inevitably have to arise from slum conditions around the world, including the United States of America? It is, as I say before, a tough situation. The iconic evocation of the Ma'abara, the iconic artistic evocation of Ma'abara, is of course Ephraim Kishon's famous movie and play, Salah Shabati, that we all saw so long ago when it came out in 1964. And I don't think we knew exactly what was going on because we're not Israelis, except the Israelis among us. Ephraim Kishon was a Jew from Hungary, assimilated, who makes Aliyah in 1949, who is a victim of this system. He goes through all this Ma'abara junk. He lands on his feet because he's from Budapest, he's an educated guy, and he makes it his business to learn Ivrit, and he gets himself a job eventually with a newspaper after a long time, and it becomes Israel's most famous humorist. Does anybody remember him from yesteryear? He's no longer alive. He writes all these wonderful, humor in the good sense. It's not a cunning, nor is this movie. It wins international awards, by the way. Brilliant but sharp satire, this movie, but not with the intention to hurt, but to enlighten. A satire at its best. Salah Shabati is as you'll see in a minute, and I'm sure some know and I'm sure some don't know. I keep being reminded by people that I take too much for granted from my audience. But I see you in the back. Yeah. Salah Shabati is a Jew, the archetypal Jew. They don't tell you where he's from. He's from Morocco, he's from Yemen, it doesn't matter. He's Jew from Edom Mizrach, and he comes to Israel. It's supposed to be during these years, the movie's a little bit changed. He comes to Israel, he ends up right away in the Ma'abara. They tell him, we'll take you to Shikun, but they don't. They lie to him and take him to Ma'abara, which is a slum, and it's a bunch of shacks and all the rest of it. I can't show you the whole movie, of course. They keep promising him to give him the Shikun, and he can't do it. He has to learn to lie and cheat and steal and all this kind of stuff in order to get along with the Israeli system. It's written by a humorist, not out to really hurt Israel, but to poke fun, as is right, at its flaws to improve the system. And so it has a happy ending. But the happy ending is typical Israeli. He finally figures out if he says, I don't want you to give me a house, they will, because they always do the opposite of what you want. You understand? Tamim mekablim ma shelo rotzim, ma sherotzim lo mekablim. That's the slogan of the movie. And so he says, Ani lo rotzeh shikun, ani rotzeh ma'abara. They say, oh, then you're going to the shikun, right? But that's the end. Along the way, he has a lot of adventures. And this is a brilliant humorist over here. This won, I think, Academy Award as Best Foreign Film in 1964. When the movie was first shown, the Speaker of the House in Israel, Yitzhak Sprintzak, walked out. All right? He said, this is a scandal, the guy should be arrested and all the rest of it. Golda Meir was the foreign minister at that time, said, this is banned for export. Understand? Then that's the mentality of the Mapai. The truth of the matter is, it's the best product for Israel. What do I mean when I say best product for Israel? They don't understand. A real democracy has self-criticism. True or not? You'll never get a movie, Salah Shabati, from Syria, from Egypt, from Saudi Arabia, and so forth. We don't expect this from them. From a real democracy, I'm not talking about the bitter, negative kinds of critiques you get. That's also part of democracy, unfortunately. But that's a turnoff. But when somebody's doing it in the best possible sense of, hey, there's mistakes we made, there's mistakes we make, let's face it, and all the rest of it, but they can't see it that way. So I'm going to show you now a clip of a few minutes, not long, from the movie Salah Shabati, of what it's like in the Ma'abara when it's in the rainy season. I'll just tell you very briefly over here. His kids, he sent, because he's from an Oriental country, so his kids he sends out to work, including his daughter. When he comes home, he takes the money and he wants to go to the bar. Because naturally there's a bar in Ma'abara. Well, naturally, right? Because that's what develops in a slum. Go down to this neighborhood and that neighborhood in Baltimore, Maryland, ladies and gentlemen, and you'll see on every block a church and a bar. It's called West Baltimore. So, there you have. And the point's like this. Is he the bad person? Or is he the victim of a system? So let's take a look at this for a minute. See the streets. That's his daughter. Leaky roof.
מה יש, סאלח?
אני לא אוהב את המדריך הזה מהקיבוץ, הוא מסובב לחבובה את הראש שלו.
חבובה בחורה טובה.
אני אמרתי שהיא רעה, אבל אני רוצה שבערב היא תהיה בבית.
בבית? איפה יש פה בית? איפה? זה בית זה? לא עושה כל היום שום דבר, יושב בפוטל שלו כמו מלך, ואומר בית, אומר.
יא אישה, אל תקשיבי איתי, תני חלב לפולה שלך ותשתקי,
שש כל היום שש עם הגולדנשטיין הזה, שלא מתבייש. אשכנזי הוא משחק שש.
כולם יהודים, אין הבדל.
כמה שנים לשבת פה. הקטנים מתגלגלים בלכלוך, הגדולים מסתובבים כמו פושעים.
אני אשם אני?
אולי הממשלה עשתה לי הילדים? תלך לעבוד, שיהיה לנו בית.
מה לעשות? מה לעשות? אמרו יתנו שיכון, לא נותנים. כולם מקבלים, רק אני לא, מה לעשות? מה לעשות?
ערב טוב.
זה הכסף.
איזה כסף?
הכסף שקיבלת ביעור, מה יש?
לקח גם משמעון כל מה שהרוויח. ילך לשתות בבית קפה. שקור.
זה הכסף.
We'll return to this shortly, but I think you see what I mean when I say a true artist knows how to do it. And by 1952, 250,000 people in these Mabarot. 250,000. Where will they be? When will they be given housing? It will not happen in 48 to 52. It just won't happen. The minister in charge of housing, Minister of Labor, including housing, Golda Meir, right, was 51 at this time, and her plus, very energetic, no question, hard worker. Her minus, totally unimaginative and totally unwilling to ever accept criticism, which is a tragic flaw in a figure of authority. And so I would even say Golda Meir is the personification of the psychological problem that I'm referring to, which is, as all the Vatikim think, we had it hard when we came, so should they. Life is not a gift. They didn't get it. That's how they talked. We did not have big houses, neither should they. Golda is in favor of, as Minister of Housing, very socialist, small houses and small apartments. These are the worst aspects of socialist Zionism, because socialism in general now that the 20th century's over, really messed up in the housing. I don't have to tell to this audience, I'll bet you just about everybody, or many of you, have had one occasion or another since you moved into your home to expand it. Am I right? The housing improvement is a good business in this area, and that means that the existing housing we built was not adequate for the needs. And we have palaces compared to what they had over there. Okay? A family with so and so many kids, even with 2 or 3 kids, is tiny confining. And by the way, it's counter demographic because Israel was committed, as it ought to have been, to have as big a population as necessary to hold that against the Arabs. It's still officially their policy. It's called a natalist policy, where you encourage births and all the rest of it. The one way to kill that is inadequate housing. The one way to encourage that is give everybody, especially families like Saleh Shabati, big house with 10 rooms. I know it sounds funny what I'm saying, but this is what the historians and the demographers and the sociologists will tell you. You understand? So Israel then and afterwards has had this problem. Anytime you say something to her, she says, "Oh, what do you want? Palaces, we're doing them a favor. When they come to this country, they didn't even know how to use a mazleg, a fork and a spoon, and we're teaching them the basic rudiments." Like this is a school for teaching people Western values. I mean, that's not what it was about. And so the number of houses and apartments in 49, for example, very small. She promised 30,000 houses, tiny, and she built 17,000. For the kind of mobs that we're talking about pouring into the country every single day, every single week, this is completely inadequate. The chief critic of the housing policy, by the way, is the General Zionist Party. But before I do that, I skipped. I want to show you a piece over here, another piece, a small clip from Saleh Shabati, where he goes to get public work project, Yi'ur, forestry, right, to work on building forests, which sounds great when they go to Israel and they show you this was built by the JNF and all the rest of it. But in point of fact, you'll see that he runs into what they call the Pakid, the government bureaucrat, who will tell him right now, he says, "You're complaining? I ate grass when I came to this country. You should be glad what it is." And in the purely Central European bureaucratic tradition, just stamp the thing and go for Yi'ur, which is from the word Ya'ar, forest. You go for Yi'ur and get the heck out of here. Take a look.
יאור, הבא בתור, שמך, מקצוע, טכנאי שיניים. יאור, למדתי 6 שנים. לא מעניין אותי מה למדת. גם אני למדתי ועבדתי בכבישים. יאור,
That's the Pakid.
הבא בתור, שמך, כמה גינשטוק, מקצוע, תגיד גבוה. יאור, אין אתה כמו כל החדשים בארץ. אבא בתור.
טוב שלך, אבא.
לא, אני לא רוצה, אני מפחד ממנו.
אבא, בשביל השיקום שלנו. בשביל השיקום.
טוב, אבל אתם נשארים איתי כל הזמן, אני לא הולך לבד, אה? אנחנו כאן. אבא בתור. שלח שבתי. מקצוע. שנדל"ן. יאור, תודה רבה, יאור זה מצוין יאור. היי יאור, כאשר אני באתי ארצה קיבלתי כל עבודה שנתנו לי. אכלתי עשב חביבי, גרתי בשדה. יאור. אבל אני רוצה. לא נכפה, יאור.
Look at this.
החדשים האלה, איזה חומר אנושי.
Right? That's the language. That's the old racist language. It's a bad chomer enoshi, right? This is, as I say before, in a humorous way, but he's trying to give you an insight into the time. The chief critic of the housing policy was the General Zionist. That was the what we would call today the ZOA in Israel. They protested very strongly. They say you have to give a big house and this, that, and the other. And Golda Meir was always fighting with them, and he said, "No, you're all trying to undermine us." And you want to live in palaces and all the rest of it. Well, when the elections came in 1951, right in the middle of all this, the General Zionists tripled from 7 to 21. The Mapai held on also. So the General Zionist victory didn't result in a displacement of the Mapai, of Ben-Gurion's party, from power. How did they hold on to 45 seats, the Mapai? That means they got votes in the Ma'abara. How do you get votes in the Ma'abara? You'd think there might be anti. Well, you do it through Tammany Hall. You do through classic, what should I say, inner city machine politics that you're going to see in a second. Okay, brilliantly shown in Saleh Shabati. And quite frankly, you find the preference in housing will be given to Mapai supporters, you understand? And among the Sephardim especially, all you do is you find the head of the Chamulah, you find the head of the clan, the important guy in the community, and you bribe him, and then you say, now you get all your relatives and friends to do it. And that, I hate to say, you know what Abraham Lincoln said, you can fool some of the people all the time. That worked for many years. You understand? Democracy is self-correcting eventually. But eventually it's a long time, and I don't think this works now, but it did at that time, and it is what it is. I'll say no more. I'll show you this scene in the movie. Announcement of elections. These are the two Mapai representatives from party headquarters. Cynical. Two Ashkenazim.
למה שולחים אותנו לחור מחורבן כזה?
וידוע לך, המפלגה מייחסת חשיבות לכל קול. טוב, מה לעשות? אני אגיד לך. על פי ניסיוני העשיר בשלוש בחירות רצופות, קיימת במעברה שיטה יעילה אחת. למצוא את מנהיגם של אנשי המקום. את האיש החזק, את מלך המעברה וזהו. שלום ידידי. שלום. איפה כולם? איפה היא? בבית הקפה? תחנה בצד.
Who's the boss?
הקיצור, מר שבתי, מה התנאים שלך? בשביל הצבעה שלי, קודם כל אני צריך שיכון. שם. אנחנו כבר בונים. אתה תהיה הראשון שיתכנס. אני? אנו לא רק מבטיחים, אנו גם מקיימים. היום זה טוב מאוד. אני יכול כבר להיכנס שם רק אחרי ההצבעה. מה חשוב לפני אחרי מה חשוב?
In other words, he doesn't understand the process, but you get the point. This is how it's done. And by the way, this worked until 1977. In point of fact, nothing really changed. If you know the story, he will not get the house. As all this is happening, and I'll try to conclude as quickly as possible, as all this is happening, the other Israel, the Yishuv, is having a different and rather thrilling 4 years. Freed of having to worry about housing and food, they can concentrate on larger national issues. They can enjoy the thrill of living in a new country. Although they too will resent that Sena, with which this guy will be associated, we'll talk about that, where they introduce rationing and things like that. But they can enjoy it, not the 250,000 people in the Mabarot. And so, thus, the tiny, poor state, which faces a multitude of external problems, such as national security and economic growth, is plagued by a deep social division of its Jewish population into two unequal halves, the haves and the have-nots. In the long, long run, it will turn the left into a minority party and will fuel the rise of this fellow. Good night.